My name is Julienne Price and I'm the Executive Manager of Professional Services for the Commonwealth Bank. And during today's webinar, I'll be joined by Belinda Allen, Director of Economics at CommBank, and also my colleague Daniela Passini, National Director of Professional Services, who will host our Q&A session towards the end of this webinar. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm coming to you from today, and that's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to the lands on which you're all coming from today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging from all the lands in which we join in today's webinar. So thanks again for joining. We're really pleased to present the headline findings of the Accounting Market Pulse report, which are pleasingly very positive, but certainly there are some challenges ahead, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But before we go into the findings of the research, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Belinda Allen, who will provide us with a view of the economic outlook, which ties in really nicely with the findings that have come out of this year's research. So thank you, Belinda, for joining, and over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining today. So before you find out the details of the Accounting Pulse report, I'll just spend around 10 minutes just on the current economic landscape in Australia. And there are some really common themes that we're seeing both at the national level, but as well as at the industry level as well. So I'll just show a few charts throughout my presentation. And I think the most important point to make at the start is we have started an interest rate tightening cycle in Australia. And really over the past 2 months, most of the economic news we've heard in Australia really has to do with higher interest rates and high inflation. And I do think it's important to put why that is happening in context. And the first point to make is the activity side of the Australian economy remains very strong. And that's actually one of the reasons why the Reserve Bank of Australia has started lifting interest rates. Now, when we look at the activity side of the Australian economy, we think about economic growth, we think about consumer spending, we think about business investment, and certainly all those metrics remain very strong. So generally here at CBA, we have very strong internal data that we can help generate our insights for what is happening in the Australian economy. So I will show you some of that data today. But firstly, as you can see on the screen, the chart on the left-hand side is just showing you our forecast for the economic growth, but also the unemployment rate. And the Australian economy grew by around 4.5% in 2021, and we're expecting it to grow by another 4.5% in 2022. So that's a really strong growth rate for the Australian economy. What we saw over the past 2 years is some downturns because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Restrictions have now really been fully eased across Australia, and we've seen quite a swift recovery from those long Delta lockdowns experienced in New South Wales and Victoria. And with the virus circulating still in the community, we haven't really seen any continued impact on the economy as a result of COVID-19. In contrast, what we do continue to see is very strong growth in the consumer. So what you see in the charts on the right-hand side of your screen is our CBA internal credit and debit card spending data. Now, we receive this data very quickly each week. So, for example, today we received data that was for spending up until midnight on Friday. Now, this data is obviously very important when we start to think about the impact on the consumer from higher interest rates. We'll be able to judge any impact very swiftly, given the timeliness of our own data. So the middle chart is showing you overall consumer spending in the Australian economy. what we've seen, as I said, is a very swift recovery from the long Delta lockdowns. But something to be aware of is probably just over the last few weeks, we have stopped seeing an acceleration in consumer spending. Instead, what we've seen is a continued normalization in spending trends. So during the pandemic, we spent a lot more money on goods, particularly household goods and food goods, than we normally would if we weren't in a pandemic. But what we have continued to see is a shift from goods spending to services spending. So items particularly like travel, recreation, personal care services have been really strong performers in 2022 to date in the Australian economy. So we're obviously watching consumer spending very carefully as the Reserve Bank of Australia starts to lift the cash rate. And in particular, we think categories like household furnishings and equipment will be one of the first categories to really show up any impact from a weaker consumer. But there are still some tailwinds for the consumer. Australians have a very large pool of accumulated savings that took place during the pandemic. So on our calculations, consumers saved around $265 billion more than they would normally have over the pandemic. So that's roughly about 10% of economic activity in Australia. So very large buffers out there in the household sector that will provide some cushioning given the high interest rates. We also received some very positive data on business investment late last week. So business investment in the 2010s, particularly around 2015 to 2019, was really soft in the Australian economy. Whereas what we've seen over the past year or so is a real large acceleration in business investment in the non-mining sector, both from plant and equipment, but also through a lift in spending on buildings and structures as well. So looking at the recent data, we expect business investment to grow by around 14% this current financial year, but accelerate to the strongest record we've seen in a few decades to around 16% in 2022-23. So that will really help broaden and strengthen the outlook for the Australian economy. And business investment is a really important tool to help fight inflation as well, because increasing a productive capacity of the Australian economy will help control inflation in the longer term. So some really positive sides to the activity side of the Australian economy. But what we're also seeing and hearing is Australian businesses are really now up against capacity constraints. And the first way to really see that is through the labour market. Now, what we're hearing from all our customers and what we're seeing in the data that we monitor for the Australian economy is that the labour market is incredibly tight. The best way to see that is the chart on the middle part of your screen that has the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is currently 3.9%. So that's the lowest since 2008. And we're expecting it to fall even lower over the course of this year, down to around 3.8%, if not a little bit lower. But what we've also seen is a large fall in the underemployment rate. Now, the underemployment rate measures people who may want to move from part-time to full-time, or who may want to work more hours. And that's the blue line you see in that middle chart. That's now fallen to 6.1%. Also the lowest since 2008. So it's very hard to attract a marginal worker at the moment into the workforce, but also for them to get even more hours, because the number of people who want to work more hours is pretty limited at the moment. The participation rate's also at close to a record high. So the amount of people that actually want to work is actually the largest on record. And when we look at the forward-looking indicators of labour demand, particularly job vacancies, that's the chart on the right-hand side of your screen, that's also at record high levels. So at the moment, there's over 400,000 vacant jobs in the Australian economy. And importantly, there's only around 550,000 people who are unemployed. So those people who are actually looking for work but can't find one. So the gap between those two is exceptionally low. So businesses are finding it incredibly more challenging to find the right person to fit the role. And we're seeing that in particular industries such as hospitality, health, professional services. So there are parts of the Australian economy and businesses in the Australian economy who can no longer expand because they cannot find the workers to do so. Now we're starting to pick that up in terms of prices and wages. So inflation in the Australian economy is at the highest level since the GST was introduced back in 2001. And there's three main reasons for higher prices. Petrol prices, I'm sure we're all seeing that when we're filling up our car. Food prices, a lot of that has been driven by stronger meat prices. The floods have really lifted fruit and vegetable prices, but also supply chain constraints, lifting things like transport prices to move that food, and that's also impacting higher inflation. The third cause of higher inflation is actually the cost of building a new home. So building costs, particularly driven by higher raw material prices, has contributed to higher rates of inflation. Now, one area that we haven't seen such broad-based gains in prices is wages. Now, this is really at odds with the tight labour market we know and can see in the Australian economy. So the latest data we're receiving on wages growth was released about 2 weeks ago, and it showed that overall wages growth in the Australian economy was running at about 2.4%. Now, using our internal data at CBA, we're seeing it track a little bit stronger than that at 2.7%. But what is pretty clear is at the moment, there's no broad-based wages growth going on. We're seeing it stronger in some industries, particularly rental and real estate, manufacturing and professional services. Wages growth is certainly accelerating faster there than other industries like mining and utilities. But what we've also seen from the data is it's a relatively small proportion of workers who are getting large pay rises. So on the latest data, only around 10 to 15% of the workforce were getting pay rises at a greater than 3% rate. So we are not seeing broad-based wage gains come through. We feel it will, but is just taking some time. The minimum wage decision that will be handed down over coming weeks could well accelerate that wages pressure throughout the rest of the Australian economy. But with high inflation and signs wages growth is emerging, we did see the Reserve Bank of Australia start their interest rate hiking cycle back in May. So the Reserve Bank of Australia lifted the cash rate from just 0.1% to 0.35%. And with inflation expected to accelerate further, as well as wages growth, we have further rate hikes penciled in for the Reserve Bank of Australia over coming months. So that will take the cash rate from the current rate of 0.35% to 1.6% in early 2023. Now, there's a couple points to make about this. The chart on the left is showing you CBA's rate hike profile compared to what markets are pricing in. So with us only having the cash rate at 1.6%, it's much lower than what we're seeing financial markets and other forecasters priced in. Now, the reason why we're taking a more conservative approach to higher interest rates is really the sensitivity of Australia's housing market to higher interest rates. So we have a whole lot of fixed rate loans expiring over coming years, and that will also tighten interest rates in the Australian economy and put more pressure on the serviceability of debt. But also, if we take the cash rate back up to 2.5%, that would lead to record high mortgage repayments as a share of disposable income. And that will probably require too much work on households by cutting back discretionary spending and impact the economy much more than is needed to control inflation and the outlook for wages. So we have a much shallower rate hike cycle by the Reserve Bank. There are a couple points to note about the outlook. A lot of questions we're getting asked is about the impact of borders reopening, any changes to migration caps. There's been no changes so far. What we've seen in the very early stages of the border reopening is only a small lift in arrivals to date. It will take many years to rebuild population growth back to where it was pre-pandemic, but we are certainly looking at the monthly numbers to seeing how quickly we're seeing foreign workers come back offshore. Now, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to Q&A later, and I will pass back to Julienne now. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Belinda, and it's good to see and hear that there's such positive sentiment in the economy, which ties in, as one would expect, into the research that has come out of the Accounting Market Pulse support, considering accounting firms are supporting the foundations of the economy with all the businesses in which they support. So now, with this report in its 7th year, our annual pulse check of the trends shaping the industry and the outlook among firms, confidence is really high. It's the highest since the research actually began. One managing partner actually embodied the positive tone across the sector, saying there are opportunities around every corner and that the real challenge is which to pursue, and that is which to say no to. So really what's coming out of the research is the only real challenge firms face, and you touched on this earlier, Belinda, is access to talent. And that's what will keep pace, or help them keep pace with growth opportunities. So I think the limited border openings are really being felt across this industry. But this year we sought to understand which firms had best adapted to one of the big pandemic-induced changes across the economy, and one which we've all felt, and that's accelerated digital transformation. We looked at the traits of digital leaders to understand where they are investing and what sets them apart from the rest. Interestingly, it was revealed that they are also the firms setting the pace of growth. So we'll explore these findings today over the next 15 or so minutes and offer some comparisons also with our legal market pulse report to provide a view across the professional services industry as it evolves and grows. As you'll see, business confidence among firms is high and demand is robust. So it won't be just those in the industry wondering how long conditions will last. It's there for the broader economy. So let's take a look at what firms have to say about current and future conditions. Among the 45 firms we spoke to, which included a strong representation of different types and sizes of firms, the vast majority had a positive view of current conditions. This is not simply a continuation of the rebound in optimism we saw last year. No, in fact, it marks a new and more stable phase of positive sentiment. Not to mention, it's also the highest measure of confidence that we have seen since the research began in 2015. One of the regional firms we spoke to explained that many businesses are growing very quickly amid the recovery, and they need support to make sure that it's sustainable. And I think, Belinda, you touched on that with regards to the challenges to growth when there aren't the resources available to help facilitate that. A larger firm said that a convergence of drivers are supporting demand, saying that elevated corporate transactions, ESG, digital transformation, and the talent agenda were the top of mind for clients. So interestingly, legal services market was similarly positive when they were polled about business conditions in late 2021. Another indication that the professional services sector is currently in a very positive and excellent shape. So the good news is positive sentiment is also translating to financial performance, with firms predicting a moderate increase in profits this financial year compared to last. Last year, we saw that firms had posted even higher profits in FY21, but expected that to settle in the current financial year, bringing profit growth rates across the industry into closer alignment. This isn't the only area where accounting firms differ from law firms. The medium-term outlook also highlights somewhat of different viewpoints. In answer to the earlier question about whether boom times for accounting firms will last, the response from the industry is yes, at least for the next 2 years. According to one large firm, the outlook is exceptionally strong. In fact, compared to today, a high proportion of firms expect conditions to be positive over the 1 to 2 year horizon. So if realised, optimism among a net 93% of firms will set yet another new benchmark for optimism. And while there is a gradual increase in the number of accounting firms with a positive outlook, the opposite is true for law firms with a moderate decline in confidence in the medium term. So while the current conditions and outlook is favourable, the operating environment is not without its challenges. The top obstacle, according to firms, was attracting and retaining good people. This will come as no surprise to those here today, as I'm sure you're grappling with it every day. However, the research shows that talent shortages have worsened over the past 12 months. For some firms, this is having a flow-on effect, whether it's having to lift salaries to compete for talent or foregoing opportunities that would overstretch capacity. In their comments, firms highlighted a range of tactics they're using to combat the issue, including a focus on culture and nurturing staff, embracing technology to appeal to new candidates, and using digital solutions to drive efficiencies. As you can see, this is certainly an issue affecting professional services firms more broadly, and there is likely to continue to be some movement between law firms and accounting firms, particularly in areas of the market where there is greater diversification into each other's practice areas. So that sets the scene for the opportunities and the challenges that firms are facing. But which firms in particular are best placed to capitalise? As we know, one of the biggest shifts during the pandemic has been the acceleration of all things digital. And that permeates all areas of a business, from how teams work together in a hybrid work environment, the technology that supports digital service delivery, to the rise of data and analytics. And while the digital transformation of firms has picked up pace, it's also a continuation of many years of investment. In this year's report, we wanted to understand what digital leaders in the accounting sector look like, what strategies they are pursuing, and where they are investing. To do this, we developed 5 core criteria that would separate leaders in digital from followers and allow us to examine what sets them apart. So based on the 5 criteria, which are finding remote or hybrid work manageable or easy, the same of digital service delivery, having digital skills that were average or above, realising moderate to very high ROI on tech investment, and adopting emerging technologies over the next 3 years. Just 15 of the 45 firms participating in the survey met everyone, and this group are categorised as the digital leaders. They tend to be large firms or mid-sized firms. But there was more to this group who met our definition of digital leadership. Looking more closely revealed a range of attributes that supported their leadership more broadly and suggests they may be the firms that are setting the pace for growth. But even through a pure technology lens, they are looking at digital solutions for different reasons. It'll come as no surprise that digital leaders are more likely to have adopted and now frequently use a range of technologies. Cloud-based solutions, document automation, and social media were more prolific among digital leaders, with data and analytics really standing out. What's interesting is looking at the differences in why firms are adopting technology. For example, most digital leaders wanted to embed the perception of their innovation and digital leadership, and they were seeking to develop new capabilities. The benefits of efficiency and resulting cost management were also more prevalent among the leaders. One of the other drivers of digital leaders' agenda was enhancing the client experience. This was summed up by one senior leader within a large firm who said every client conversation is now grounded in technology. Clients want insights at speed, and technology is the engine to support that. But we hear regularly about digital skills shortages across the economy, and firms are moving to develop new capabilities in different ways to sustain their transformation agendas. What we found was that there are 4 areas where firms want to develop competencies over the next 3 years, irrespective of whether they are a leader or a follower. This includes RegTech and compliance-related digital tools, data-related expertise, social media and personal branding capabilities, and of course, cybersecurity. So where digital leaders stand out is on their focus in building skills in emerging areas: data science and machine learning, robotic process automation, and using ERP software were the most prominent. But if you look at the leaders, they're really peering across the technology spectrum and seeking to develop multifaceted base of digital capabilities. And according to those we spoke to, there are a range of strategies to develop these capabilities, from running internal programs to upskilling their workforce, engaging external consultants, and leveraging partnerships. The benefits of getting it right are front of mind too. One managing partner of a regional firm said to us, "It's now a matter of getting the right people and digital resources behind us to capture that demand, while keeping our standards of client service and operational efficiencies high." In a way, this neatly encapsulates the drivers and the focus. So where to from here in firms' growth strategies? Despite the strong demand for competition among firms presenting few problems, firms aren't resting on their laurels. Rather, they are seeking to sustain the growth momentum they are currently experiencing. Marketing the firm and a focus on business development pipeline was the top-rated investment and growth strategy over the next 3 years, followed by cross and upselling to drive organic growth within their existing client base. It's interesting to note that there's a difference in the focus when looking at digital followers versus the leaders. Not only are they more likely to be pushing for new business, but they are also more confident in lifting fees. In keeping with their focus on innovation and positioning the firm, they are looking at new service delivery models and either incubating new businesses or investing in startups. And they are seeking to use their culture as a competitive advantage to help drive performance. And this comes through their financial forecasts, in the short term at least. As you can see, digital leaders have a brighter profit forecast for the financial year. And this suggests that with a better ability to invest in technology and their growth strategies, they are likely to pull further ahead of their peers. In terms of what will support that growth, there are different demand drivers emerging. Digital transformation, ESG issues, and big data are not only a focus internally, but they are also driving client needs for service and support. And we're certainly seeing that in the banking industry as well. In other words, of one managing partner, ESG is at the heart of strategy and driving business transformation. And in turn, that's supporting transactional activity. So you can see some of these areas have a broader influence, given they are shaping the future of our economy as a whole. So that brings us to our close of our key highlights and findings. And these are: confidence is high. It's set to get higher, and firms are taking control of this opportunity by doubling down on initiatives to drive new business. Digital leaders are setting the pace in more ways than one. They stand out for their approach to transformation and are developing the culture to support it. So I think you can see that there is a positive outlook, and the common trends and thoughts that are front of mind for accounting firms, a great positivity with a real challenge around retaining and growing that the talent that is required to support that growth. So we hope you enjoyed the highlights of these findings. We will be sharing these research report with you all, and you'll find them on our various social media channels. But I'd now like to pass over to Daniela Passini, who will host our Q&A session between Belinda Allen and myself. So over to you, Daniela.
Thank you, Julienne. So we just had Julienne Price there present to us an exclusive preview of this year's Accounting Market Pulse report and start to look at those key questions that are on our mind, like, will the boom last? What are digital leaders doing differently? And finally, whether or not the accounting firms will overcome the greatest barrier of all, which is talent. So, and thank you to Belinda. Welcome, Belinda. Welcome back into our Q&A session. Belinda provided us an economic outlook and touched on some of the levers around that cash rate prediction. So let me open up to Q&A here. The first question is for Belinda. Belinda, what can we expect in terms of the immigration returning to Australia?
Labour constraints are certainly at the top of everyone's minds at the moment, just as we heard from the report as well, but just also for broader pressures in the Australian economy at the moment. So we are expecting only a very gradual lift in net overseas migration. So a number of policies remain unchanged. So the skilled migration cap remains at 160,000. There have been no changes to that. And with the new government, we also haven't heard any changes in that program as well. So when we think about migration coming into Australia, we obviously have permanent migrants who generally fall under the skilled migration cap. And on that, we're hearing it is just taking so long to get migration approvals through at the moment, almost a doubling, if you like, in the time taken to get applications approved. We have seen a slow return in working holiday makers. So we have seen, since borders have been reopened, a small lift in people coming in, I guess, on temporary work visas as well. So that's more likely to help your hospitality, your retail sector, but not your professional services sector, who would be much more reliant on the return of skilled migration. And on that, it is very much a slow burn. So if we look at the forecasts that were released in the budget back in March, In the current financial year, which is almost up, the government was expecting only a lift of 40,000 in net overseas migration. That lifts to 180,000 in the 2022-23 financial year, and then just a little bit above 200,000 in the financial year after that. Now, that's still not up to the levels that we saw prior to the pandemic, where we were seeing around 250,000 net overseas migrants come to Australia each year. So it's about 5 years in total where we'll see a much smaller migration program and no period for catch up. So it is very much a slow burn issue, and it's unlikely that we'll see, in the near term at least, a big change to the pressures on the labour side that's been experienced by many customers and clients that we're seeing in the Australian economy.
Thanks, Belinda. So it sounds like we will need to grow that small group that you spoke about in your first economic outlook, and grow it here in Australia. Another question's come through for you, Belinda, around what will happen to wages growth going forward, do we think? And I know that was a key topic that we looked at.
Yes, that's right. I think it's on the top of everyone's minds at the moment, particularly because I think the official statistics aren't really reflecting what we're hearing from a lot of our customers and businesses that we talk to in Australia at the moment. So as I said, the official wages growth data is at just 2.3%, and that's really measuring getting a pay rise for doing the exact same job. Obviously, if you see more turnover, a promotion, you're more likely to get a pay rise in the Australian economy. And so that's happening, but to give someone a pay rise to do the same job, we haven't seen that accelerate too much yet. As I said, it's a small proportion of workers who are receiving a larger pay rise at the moment. Now, it's really interesting because when we look at the situation in Australia, where we have a very tight labour market but subdued wages growth, and compare it to, say, the US. Now, in the US, they also have a very tight labour market, but wages growth is closer to 4%, so much higher than what we saw in Australia. So one of the main reasons for that was the JobKeeper program here in Australia. So JobKeeper was very successful at keeping the employee and the employer together. In the US, where there wasn't that program, when economies reopened and we had a very swift recovery, people had to go out there and get a new job and negotiate their wage, and they got a pay rise as a result, because you're more likely to get a pay rise when you have turnover in the labour market. So that explains the difference we have, say, in Australia compared to the US, is we haven't seen that turnover in the labour market that we have offshore. Now, we're starting to see that pick up. So we would anticipate wages growth to lift from here. So in our forecast, we have wages growth moving above 3% over the course of 2023, and then remaining at a higher level than what we've seen in the past. One of the big issues, I think I said during my presentation, is the minimum wage decision that will come down in the next few weeks. A lift in the minimum wage, that's been talked about between 4 and 5%, would see around 30% of workers receive a pay rise of around 4 to 5%. So that will actually contribute to stronger wages growth in the Australian economy. And one other factor that we can't forget is we've had quite large public sector wage caps at the state government level. So that's also been holding back wages growth, but we're starting to see some of them lift. In New South Wales, for example, that's been lifted, and that will also contribute to stronger wages growth over time. But we expect the tight labour market to continue given that lack of lift in net overseas migrants, and so we should expect wages growth to continue to accelerate from here.
Thanks, Belinda. Sounds like there is some thought to be given by the firms around how they might differentiate themselves when it comes to that war for talent. So thank you for the insights. And the next question is actually for Julienne. Comment is, good to hear confidence is at an all-time high. What do we see as the biggest challenge for us accountants right now in this environment?
Well, I think, the research strongly states, in fact, 93% of the recipients said that their biggest challenge is finding quality staff and retaining high quality staff. And then Belinda's intimated some of the reasons for those challenges. And I think, there's such a high demand for accounting services that just perpetuates the challenge. In fact, the research said that it is the only significant factor holding back growth for the accounting industry. So I think that's something that would be considered the main challenge that the industry is facing at this point in time.
Thanks, Julienne. And perhaps the second challenge might be the fact that we discovered only a third of our group surveyed were considered to be digital leaders. So the rest of us, I suppose, are playing catch up. And the next question says, we like this concept of digital leaders. That was interesting. Thank you. What skills do you think they will need and will be on the hunt for, those digital leaders?
Yeah, that was really interesting. It was really interesting to see the difference between digital leaders and the followers. And it's those firms that have invested heavily, not only in technology, but in their people to embrace technology, to be upskilled in technology, and have given their people the freedom to explore themselves areas that they need to grow in and develop in, has set the leaders apart from the followers. It was interesting to read also the firms that allow or encourage their staff to use innovation, design jams, hackathons to find solutions to client problems. Not the traditional way to address problems, certainly, but it's something that is attracting people to organisations where there's that opportunity to look at things differently. What we know that's come out of the research is that 60% of the firms surveyed are looking for competencies in 4 key areas. And I think that's quite a high percentage when we're talking about that's the overall cohort of organisations surveyed. And those 4 areas, again, are using RegTech or compliance technologies, data analytics, social media and online personal branding, and cybersecurity. So we know cybersecurity has been a focus for organisations and businesses for many years, but it's only increasing its level of importance in the work that we all do across the economy. And so I think that's going to remain on the agenda for some time.
Thank you, Julienne. And talking about leadership, we have time for one more question. So back over to you, Belinda. Impact of the election result. Do you have any final thoughts or comments before we wrap up this Q&A session?
Yes, good question. So thank you for asking that one. So I guess as an economist, I guess we need to focus on what would the change of government do to near-term economic growth and the near-term outlook for monetary policy. So that's generally our focus. So what we've seen so far, particularly during the election campaign and the policies being offered, is we don't see any near-term change in our economic forecast for the Australian economy, and also any implications for our forecasts for the Reserve Bank of Australia. So we haven't changed our forecast. We still think the Reserve Bank will continue to lift the cash rate in line with our forecast. So that's rate hikes in June, July, August, November this year, and a final one in February next year. there are some key policy differences between this government and the former government that will likely impact some industries, so particularly increased focus on childcare, on aged care, on health in particular. But I think the largest difference is the difference in climate change policies. So the current government, the new government, is targeting a 43% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. The previous government had an aim of around 26 to 28% reduction in carbon emissions. So the changing government will see an acceleration in that goal, and there'll have to be new policies introduced to meet that change in carbon emissions. So that will be the biggest change, but that will obviously take place over the next 8 years to meet that goal. But that is probably the one that is worth highlighting.
Thank you, Belinda. So that sounds like it's the slowest burn of all. Which might not be such bad news. Well, that brings us to the end of today's Q&A session. Thank you to Belinda, thank you to Julienne, and thank you to everyone for joining the Q&A. And I'll now hand back. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela, and thank you, Belinda, and thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. We really appreciate those of you also who have participated in the research. We're going to wrap up with a video, very short video, to share with you for the first time in market, and that is a video on CommBank's focus and commitment to the professional services industry. So with that, I say good afternoon, and I wish you all a very good week. Thanks very much.
CommBank Professional Services is committed to developing specialist solutions to help you manage your clients' money securely. CommBank's cash management solutions will save you time and help you operate securely. CommBank Professional Services, the specialists in specialized cash management solutions.